Well, what's a Monday without a Rocket acquisition? This time, it is Mr. Cooper. Joining me now is Brian Hale, a man who has been involved in so many mergers and acquisitions. Brian, good to see you again. I know you're on vacation. I am on vacation, but this is indeed breaking news as Rocket seems to own the news cycle at this time. What's your first reaction to this?
Well, clearly, Rocket's not on vacation, right? That should be clear to us. We're the only two that are, apparently. My first reaction to this is, look, I thought that the Rocket Redfin deal was material to the industry and certainly directional for the industry. And what I mean by that is that I anticipate other kinds of combinations, mergers. I think it also signals a little bit, Greg, that we may be closer to the end of the difficult times. In my 43 years of doing this, typically towards the end of bad cycles like we've been in for the last 3 years, you start seeing real consolidation in large players moving together to gain scale, to lower their operating cost, and kind of prepare for the next run. And I think we're seeing that a little bit. The second thing I would say is this is much bigger than Redfin in my view, and that it gives Rocket 1 in 6 mortgages from a servicing standpoint in the U.S., the 50 million hits to the Redfin portal on a monthly basis. And then on top of that, Rocket's origination and TPO businesses. The notable difference and where I think this is going to move Rocket in a very significant way, when you compare a Rocket and a UWM, and we know that those guys have been banging heads for the last couple of years, the big difference here is that Rocket controls their sales force and can direct them, and in many ways is much lower cost, right, from almost most originators because of the consumer direct model. They pick up a street model with the Redfin acquisition, vis-a-vis the Bay Equity acquisition that Redfin did a few years ago. But the fact that they can control their workforce, control the sales force, direct them on recapture between the two servicing portfolios of Rocket and Mr. Cooper, add Mr. Cooper's capability, which, by the way, is world-class in terms of recapture capability, maybe best in class, tied best in class with PennyMac, right along that piece. But scale is really going to matter. Lower cost operating model is really going to matter. And this is a big deal, I think. Again, like you and I talked last time on the Redfin deal, subject to execution, right? People actually have to go out and do what's the promise of this deal is. Time will tell, but I have a lot of respect for the folks at Rocket. I have an immense amount of respect for the folks at Mr. Cooper, Jay and his team. These are some of the smartest mofos in the business, and I think this is a big, big transaction.
You and I have had conversations about deals, and the main thread that you always come back to is it a cultural fit? You've asked me in the past, what's the number one thing that makes a big deal, go south? So with that in mind, right, you've got Rocket, Redfin, you've got Mr. Cooper who acquired Flagstar pretty recently. So you've got all of these different entities folding into one. Is there a risk of doing too much at once?
Yeah, of course, there's always a risk of doing too much at once. But when you start looking at the underlying cultures, these are not two wildly divergent sales cultures coming together, right? That's where I think it's more difficult in the retail space, the wholesale space, where you have, common accounts and who's going to win and all that kind of stuff. These two groups are really a combination of what you would consider to be consumer direct, if not consumer direct, predominantly centralized retail originations, and big servicing books. So you don't have the kind of sales culture clash that you have when you put two big independent mortgage banking retail companies together, where people are, warring over accounts and who's going to be the leader and those kinds of things. These are much more corporate-oriented entities, including Redfin. So yes, by the way, you ask, is there a risk? Of course there's a risk. There's a risk that they just don't execute on this thing well. There's a risk that they didn't understand some of the cultural issues. But just as I understand business models, these two business models mesh fairly well. But hey, you got to go out and do it, right?
Yeah. Brian, also
you can be Duke. You can be Duke, right? Duke should win it all, but you got to go out and play the game.
So Mr. Cooper's got a lot in there, obviously, in terms of their portfolio, and we could be headed into a moment where rates are going to go down. And typically there's runoff We've got the debt situation in the United States with consumer debt. And so play that out for us, the possibilities.
Yeah, look, that's why I think this is a late stage acquisition, because I do believe, you and I've talked about this before, and this isn't a political comment I'm about to make, but I do think the administration believes the way to force Powell into lower rates is essentially create a recession. And I think, I saw this morning, Goldman Sachs raised its estimate of a recession from like 15% to 40 or 50%. And so we saw, the 10-year break under 430 this morning. I think we're headed for, if not a recession, a significant slowdown. And as a result of that, we could see lower rates, assuming we don't see a pop in inflation. And that's a little bit of a wild card here, right? If the tariffs do create an inflationary environment, if you can't solve the Ukraine thing, if mass deportations, rise labor cost, you could get interest rates going the wrong way, and this will be more challenged. If you get a rate run here, combining these two portfolios, combining the two origination capabilities at low cost, and skilled skinners, for the lack of a better term, right? Folks who can take leads, handle the leads, and produce. And you add to that the purchase opportunity with Redfin, with the customers hitting, those aren't refi customers for the most part hitting that portal. Those are folks thinking about buying a home. So you clearly have three legs of the stool here. Now you just got to make the stool stand up. And, it's on management from all three of the organizations to pull off this combination and make 1 + 1 + 1 = 9.
Hey, Brian, when we talked about the Redfin deal, you thought that it was a safe acquisition in that it was stock. It wasn't cash. You felt like Redfin might have been headed in the wrong direction anyway. From what I understand, this is similar. It's a stock deal. So, what does this tell you about where Mr. Cooper might have been headed?
Oh, we'll see. I mean, it's going to require stockholder approval, right? So, and some of the biggest funds in the world hold a lot of Mr. Cooper stock. And so I do think this is a couple of management teams and their boards coming together and saying, hey, look, we have a chance 1 + 1 + 1 could equal 9. And if it does, and we run into a rate run here, and I don't think we'll see kind of a rate run that we saw in 20 or 21, but if you and I've talked about this before, if you get into the low to mid fives, you have a hell of a rate run,
Well, I guess my question is, Brian, to cut you off, let's drill down more specifically to the question. You saw Redfin was a stock only deal. This is a stock only deal. In the Redfin deal, you said, well, stock only, this tells me the company might have been heading south. So why don't you immediately go to the same place?
Yeah, because I think Mr. Cooper and Redfin are two very different companies. Mr. Cooper has been a profitable company. They're well liked on Wall Street. They got a great management team. They weren't losing 165, 157 million in the last 2 years, right? They're known to be great retainers of servicing. They've got a great model, really strong management team who really knows their business.
Okay, that's fine. So I appreciate you addressing that, because others that might have watched our previous conversation, I think would naturally arrive at that question. Government
by the way,
approval.
I haven't seen that this is an all stock deal, but you tell me it is. Look, I was playing golf this morning, so I didn't get to read all the materials. My phone's been blowing up.
Yeah. So do you think that this is a layup to be approved? Do you think there could be some government intervention and they're going to hold 1 of every 6 mortgages? No. Could there be something in the way of the government getting in the way?
I don't think so. First of all, I think this administration is very M&A favorable, right, compared to the last one. I think the last one might have given this some grief, or certainly a look. I do think they'll look, because I think they need to look, right? They need to kind of show the job. But I don't, first of all, I doubt that these two teams and their boards would have struck this deal if they believed that it was going to be materially difficult to get this done. Whether somebody gives them some grief, or whether you see some states where there's some particular concentration where the AG or the bank commissioner rears up and has an opinion. But I think this gets done. And, look, you could argue that this is in the best interest of the consumer, because you've got low cost sales forces. You've got, competitive pricing. You've got great technology. And it's very consistent with what you hear coming out of the administration for the future. And you got a lot of stockholders here that are going to want to see this deal get done.
Getting towards monopoly.
I don't think. Well, Look,
Well,
I've
one of
had
every
better.
6 mortgages. I mean, do
No,
you,
no, no.
do you think that
I've
it's
had better
entering
share.
that territory?
No, no. Look, I had the good fortune early in my career to have better share than these guys have. We had a 35 share on the origination side, and at one time, countrywide was nearly 2 trillion. So this isn't. This doesn't remotely approach that, either an
All right.
origination share or servicing share. So no, I
Yeah.
don't. I don't. Monopoly is a dangerous word, and I don't think this
Yeah.
is
Well,
anywhere
I'm
near
just,
that.
I did a
What I do
post
think it does,
earlier.
Greg. Yeah, it presses people for scale.
Yeah. Well,
That's
that's, well, I want to get to that. I want to get to, is this a wake up call for the industry? And I'm going through the various threads and the feedback that's coming in hot and heavy from the industry. Before I get to that, when the Redfin deal went down, you had said, hey, this is not something that happens overnight. This has probably been in the works for months now.
yeah.
This is a deal that's so much bigger than that one. So I go back to the same question, having been at the table for so many big deals, how long does it take to get something like this done? To get to this point where there's an announcement?
Well, there's always the issue. Look, if both sides want to get it done, this thing could have got done very quickly. By quickly, I mean weeks. If you ask me, and I know nothing, so this is a kind of a wild ass guess, it probably took a couple months for this thing to really get sorted out. But if you have a motivated buyer and a motivated seller, and they can see the value of 1 + 1 + 1 = 9, then this gets done fairly quickly, and can kind of get done on the fly to some degree. But you got two big public companies here, so you're going to need stockholder approval beyond regulatory approval. And so you have to believe that the boards have been read in for a while, and that there's
Yeah.
been an awful lot of quiet conversation happening over the last couple of months.
Yeah. Brian, let's pivot into what this means for the industry. So if you're an originator, if you're a small IMB, what should you be thinking right now? Is this some kind of a wake up call? And if so, what is that call? What's it saying on the other end?
Yeah, I don't. I'm always hesitant to use the word wake up call because somehow it sounds like, game, set, match, over, right? And it's not by any stretch. What I think it does do, and again, I've seen a lot of your posts and others in the past, I think this puts a pressure on technology. It puts a pressure on your operating costs so that you can price and compete with much bigger, much more scaled competitors, folks who do have an inside track on 1 out of 6 mortgages in the US and 50 million purchase leads a month, right? So you got to get better and bigger. That's my view of this. You've got to get better at what you do. You've got to have a culture that is focused on servicing the customer, not maybe on optimizing every last nickel for your particular branch. So yeah, I don't, is it a wake up call? I don't know if it's a wake up call, but anybody who's operating today that doesn't recognize that the job just got tougher isn't paying attention.
Is this the biggest sea change that you've seen in your career potentially?
No, I think, look, in some of the deals in the 90s when Norwest Wells was rolling up banks and companies, you saw some huge deals. I think what it is, Greg, this is a continuation of what we talked about last time. I don't think this is game, set, match, but I think this is very instructive about the future of our industry to use technology, scale, and somewhat of a different operating model than what has historically gone before it. And it's not going to be wildly fat compensation plans for all sales forces where you have to price it in and somehow the customer is going to pay an extra 100 basis points in rate, or in fees, just because you like your model. There's going to be a lot of sources and other pieces. You may get the app. The question is, can you close it, right? And
Yeah.
does the customer get picked
Yeah.
off?
Brian, you've got a great relationship with Stan Middleman, who's the founder of Freedom Mortgage. You go way back, and I know you know him very well. What do you think he's thinking right now? In that seat, because he doesn't want to be, he wants to be able to compete at this level. So is his move next?
Yeah, I don't know that I can read Stan's mind, but I would say this. First of all, as long as I've known Stan, he's not a guy that freaks out when he sees news. So I think he's looking at this like a lot of the rest of the industry. I saw some texts that I got this morning. People say, "Well, I didn't have that on my bingo card." I would say a lot of people didn't have this on their bingo card, but as I said, I think you're going to see some big players start talking to each other and move to look for scale, both in servicing and origination and consumer facing portals and the use of technology and you've got to harvest out the G&A cost and reinvestment in technology. And the only way you do that is by taking two good organizations and putting them together smartly, not just foolishly, not just because you can, but because you think you have a formula that works. So I don't think it's just Stan.
Got it.
And I don't know Stan well enough to know that, but what I do know about Stan is he doesn't freak out, right? He's not a guy that is he didn't lose his breakfast this morning, but I'm sure he read this with interest and started thinking, okay, what does this mean to me?
Yeah. I asked that mainly in the context of, I've heard that they've been ramping up their retail anyway, that they've been getting ready to grab a bigger slice of the retail business. And so, I mean,
you could see that, but last time I had that conversation with Stan, he wasn't in love with retail. I can tell you that. He kind of gotten out of it intentionally, but you could, look, you could see him, pick off a retailer. You could see a lot of deals get done. Here's the problem, Greg. If you start acquiring a retailer and that retailer has a really expensive cost structure because of sales structure and comp and, too much G&A and that kind of thing, I don't know that you've helped yourself. So only smart deals make sense. Dumb deals don't make sense, period.
Yeah. Well, this is a big bet, and everybody says it's a data play. It's hard to argue that. A lot of people say this is all about AI. This is all about AI, and I know that you're deep in data and AI in many of your conversations every day. So put that puzzle together for us.
Yeah, look, I think it's absolutely a data play. I think AI is still very early on in our industry. People will figure it out, but what you have, the way I would describe this, I don't know if you're familiar with, building pots out of pottery, right? You start with a big lump of clay and then you start sculpting it. Okay, now they have a big lump of clay. Now they have to sculpt it and make it look beautiful. And you can screw a lot up on the way between the lump of clay and the finished product. But these are smart folks with a lot of capital, access to capital. And I don't know if I saw an article that suggested that Rocket got a $5 billion bridge loan to get this deal done. I have no idea if that's true or it's not true, but they're the kind of operation that can go get $5 billion bridge loan to do a deal. That's not everybody in our industry, right? So
yeah, that was in the Housing Wire article today. James Kleiman produced something earlier this morning and said that they did get a $5 billion bridge loan. So what are the economics involved in a move like that, and why would a bank make such a big bet? What can we read behind that they would, aside from the obvious that they feel like Rocket is solid? I understand that, but they're not going to invest in the sector they feel like is heading in the wrong direction. So what can we read into that?
Yeah, the people looked at the deal and said, yeah, we like it, right? For all the reasons we've already talked about. Look, you just think of the synergies. I don't know what the number is, and I haven't seen any of it, but I'm going to just guess. If you look at the two organizations, there's probably $100 to $200 million worth of synergies on the cost side that come out of this, right? So just 1 + 1 gets more favorable from a cost structure.
I read something that said 500 million.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I haven't done the math in my head, but that number wouldn't shock me at all. So just think of that. That's $500 million of additional pricing power that combined organization now has to make the same amount of money, right? And so that's what scale does for you, right? You don't need two heads of capital markets. You don't need two heads of accounting. You don't need two heads of HR, right? And you start working down through those organizations, consolidate them, merge the technology, take the best of both worlds. That's where the difficulty is, right? Getting those things to work well together, getting people to play well together, and getting your best talent not to leap out the window because they don't yet know if they're a keeper in the transaction.
Yeah, well, right? That's where I was going to go with the next question here, because I did a little research online, and from what I can tell, Mr. Cooper's got roughly 6,500 employees. Redfin had roughly 4,500. Rocket's got around 14,000. When you add those numbers up, there's 80% of Rocket's workforce. Well, the two entities represent roughly 80% of what Rocket has. So, I mean, this is the ugly side of mortgage, isn't it? We can expect, would you call it, mass casualties in something like this? There's going to be synergies. You don't make a deal. Yeah. You don't make a deal like this without feeling like there's a lot of overlapping.
That's correct, but I don't know if it's mass casualties. I think it's predominantly on the G&A side, right? Corporate expense, right? It's not on the sales force. not on the fulfillment force, unless you can, have your technology and your platform be more productive, which I think they will. And I think the whole industry is working on that. And so, yeah, you can take synergies, you can take cost structures out of this, but it's mostly going to come on the G&A side. You might get some benefit, you might get revenue benefit by being able to trade bigger blocks of loans. I mean, there's a variety of ways you get a benefit out of this, and scale and capital has always been dominant in this business. It will continue to be.
Yeah. Lastly, Brian, somebody compared this to Apple. Apple wants to own the entire mobile ecosystem. My point
Right.
is that Apple, the average purchase from a consumer is probably $500, right? I don't know how you can compare the two when the average
Yeah.
purchase price here is about
Yeah.
it's about 400,000. So my question is, obviously Rocket is they're on their way to trying to own the consumer end to end, true bill and everything else. Is that feasible? Is this bet going to
Sure.
pay off?
Yeah. What I'm not is I'm not a soothsayer, and I'm not a guy who can forecast yes or no. I think the pieces they have put together have put them in a position to make it pay off. I come back to execution. Now you got to go prove it. You got to go show it, or else, by the way, stockholders and the stock analysts will eat you alive. And so, they've put a big target on their back to execute, and they've gone out and put the pieces together to help them execute. And there's some really talented folks between all three organizations. So, I would just argue that they have the best shot of anybody. But I don't think it's game, set, match for everybody else either. I think you'll see other consolidations.
You really have to give Rocket a lot of credit, man, for putting it all on the table. I mean, the courage, the courage, the conviction, these are big boy moves, and it's going to be interesting to watch it all unfold. Brian, anything you want to add in conclusion here?
No, I got to run. But
where are you, by the way? I see some water behind you.
So I just finished playing golf at the King and Prince Golf Course on St. Simon Island in Georgia. We're heading down to Charleston this afternoon with my brother-in-law and his wife to go watch the ladies' professional tennis tournament in Charleston.
Yeah, so you're in Georgia on your way to South Carolina. I'm in Florida on my way back to DC from spring break. But of course, when the news is breaking, we got to be there for it. Brian Hale, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for making it during vacation. All right, we'll talk to you later. Brian Hale popping off. Man, timing was perfect on the signal dropping. We'll be covering this more and more in the hours and days ahead. So I hope you've enjoyed this. We'll talk soon. Take care.